Let's kick this mini-series off for real with a perfect example of current aggro in base fossil. When the format goes extra hard on control and lengthy games, aggro has to go extra hard to compete. This is an Arcanine deck with no fire energy in it. This deck's sole purpose is to fire off as many takedowns as you can, as that 80 damage is perfect for knocking out almost everything in format. The rest of the deck is just the support required to pull this off. So let's go ahead and jump right into the deck list. Let's go ahead and start off the deck with Growlithe, and it actually helps this deck quite a bit to have an evolving basic with more than 50 HP. We're looking at 60 HP here on this Growlithe boy. All you're really going to do with this Growlithe is attach a Psychic Energy to it and evolve it next turn. Otherwise, you're falling behind and you've already lost the game. Going to be running 3 copies of that Growlithe, and then also 3 copies of the Arcanine. A 100 HP stage 1 with high damage potential. This thing is scary when you drop it, especially when you're moving as quickly as this deck goes. If your setup is right, you are dealing 80 damage on turn 2. Turn 1, attach a Psychic Energy to Growlithe. Turn 2, evolve into Arcanine, attach another Psychic Energy to it, and then you're also going to evolve the Voltorb you had set up on your bench into an Electrode. That is how we are getting to 4 energy so quickly. Your 4 Voltorbs and your 4 Electrodes exist in this deck purely to evolve and explode. These Pokemon are going to be essential to you firing off those takedowns as early as possible, getting those key knockouts very early in the game, setting your opponent way back. Electrode's Buzz App Pokemon power allows you to knock out Electrode, which gives your opponent a prize, but it then transforms into a double rainbow energy that you can attach onto Arcanine. In most scenarios, you're going to be trading with your opponent. You're both taking a prize card, but you still have a 100 HP Pokemon with a fully powered takedown attack that you have to answer. The most obvious answer is using energy removal to knock that Electrode off, but Psyduck is here to help make sure your opponent doesn't do that. After you score one of these key early game knockouts, you get Psyduck into the active position and you just use Headache over and over again so that your opponent isn't playing those trainers from their hand to build back a new Pokemon, to disrupt your flow by discarding energies off of Arcanine. When their hand starts to fill up with a bunch of trainers, you hit them with a Lass, all of them go back to the deck, your Arcanine is safe to move back into the active position and start getting KOs. The other obvious answer to Arcanine is Mr. Mime. If you only have the ability to deal 80 plus damage, then Mr. Mime is just going to stall you out for the rest of the game. Ghastly is in here as the answer to Mr. Mime and the reason that this is a psychic deck. Energy conversion is also an extremely nifty attack for getting back double colorless energies from the discard. This is a base fossil deck, so starting off the trainer lineup, we're going to see just an overall great card for digging through your deck and getting the resources that you need. Not as powerful or risky as Professor Oak, which is why where we're at right now, you're going to see more reliance on Bill rather than Professor Oak, because overusing Oak can be a huge trap that you fall into early game and end up decking yourself out in these lengthy, drawn-out, methodical matches. You'll hear me repeat it throughout this series. We run for Professor Oak just so that statistically you're more likely to get an early game. You do not want to play 4 Professor Oaks in a base fossil game. You want to play 1 early game to help get your setup, and then maybe a second one if you find yourself in a pickle and you just need card draw. The other 2 you can chuck to a computer search to get a card out of your deck that you actually need without having to dig through your deck to try to find it. Computer search is going to be extremely helpful for finding those double colorless energies, maybe the Electrodes you need to really pop off, or every now and then you just need a switch or an extra defender to make sure you don't knock yourself out. Computer search has you covered. A couple copies of maintenance as well to add a little extra draw power, but also ensuring that, like we've mentioned multiple times already, that you're not decking yourself out, especially if you're playing up against these control type decks. You're looking at long games. You want to make sure you don't get got by straight up stall. Item Finder, of course, is going to help you recycle resources that you've already used. That includes your resource gathering cards like Professor Oak if you find yourself in that kind of position, but mostly we're looking at Lass. You want to use Lass over and over and over again to make sure that your opponent does not have energy removals in their hand. Prevent those momentum breaks breakers as often as possible, and generally just be annoying. So many decks are running last. It's no wonder you see the focus shift to utility Pokemon over utility trainers. It is a bit circular. You run so much draw power just in case you do get last. You draw into a build, which is going to let you draw into more cards, but even then you can just get hit with another last on the next turn. Such is the base fossil format currently. A couple copies of Pokemon Trader just for some spot check, and if you can't get the Arcanine you need, the Electrodes you need, or maybe your opponent just moved a Mr. Mime into the active position, you need to go grab a Ghastly ASAP. You can just trade the spare Psyduck in your hand or whatever else you have to go grab those. Anyone that has played an Arcanine deck before knows that Defender is amazing in this deck. You drop it before you use a takedown, it prevents 20 damage that you're dealing to yourself, and then it stays attached for your opponent's turn, reducing any damage dealt by them. A wonderful little tool for making your Arcanines as tanky as possible, keeping them in play and out of knockout range. Speaking of knockout range, you want to make sure that every time you use a takedown, that you are scoring an OHKO, and to help make that possible, we have Gust of Wind. If there's a Pokemon that has 70 HP on your opponent's bench, you're going to yank it out and knock it out. But sometimes you want to move your own Arcanine out of the active position so that you can get a Psyduck or a Ghastly up there. Instead of paying that hefty retreat cost, just use a Switch. Got a couple copies of Switch in here just for that reason. And then the rest of the deck's going to be filled out with a playset of double colorless energies and your basic psychics. The DCEs are going to be very helpful for setting up additional Arcanines on the bench. Having them ready to go for when the active Arcanine gets knocked out, you move one off of the bench that already has a DCE on it, you evolve an Electrode, you get it powered up, you do the whole thing. That's very idealistic, but the DCEs can also be used to retreat Arcanine, or at least make the retreat easier when you don't have that switch access. I think overall this deck list does exemplify where the base fossil format is right now. Even for me personally, back in the day I would say, just add an Electabuzz or a Magmar to a deck. It's a good generalist, it's a good attacker, it's a good counter, whatever. And then my opinion changed to, well, actually, Lickitung and Kangaskhan are your go-tos. They're better than those old haymakers, and now we're at a point where you can just put last Psyduck and Ghastly in a deck, and you're gonna fare pretty well against the rest of the format regardless of what the rest of the deck is doing. Even hyper aggro like this. In this current format, I think Arcanine has a better chance of being competitive than it ever did because of its stage 1 tankiness, its access to Electrode, and the fact that there's not water types running around. Rain Dance is still a thing, but because it gets spanked so hard by Lass, which is a 4 of in almost every deck now, it's also had to go hyper aggro in a similar way to Arcanine. It doesn't use Electrode, but if you don't have a Blastoise in play on turn 2, you're probably losing the game. And I wouldn't even say that this deck auto loses if a couple of energy removals get through and you're not able to adequately control your opponent's hand. It's more so about those big basic matchups where you're just barely missing a KO off of 80 damage. Mainly Lickitungs and Kangaskhan's. You want to avoid having to deal with those at all. That's why Gust is in here. So those damage swap matchups can be difficult, not because of the Mr. Mime. We have an answer to Mr. Mime. It's more of answering Lickitungs. You can solve that with a plus power. Pretty simple fix. The deck list that we talked about today doesn't have any plus power in there. I tried it with a full playset, found that it wasn't all that useful. It was taking up a lot of deck space, but there weren't a ton of scenarios where I really needed it. But that falls to personal choice and the type of metagame you anticipate playing in. Your matchups and your opening hand will determine the early playstyle of this deck, because ideally, you want to start with a Psyduck. You want to hit your opponent with an early headache. That way, they can't use all of their search and draw tools to get their setup, giving you time to set up your own Arcanines and build up a very threatening board. But you will find yourself in scenarios where getting a turn 2 takedown 80 damage OHKO on your opponent is a little bit of a requirement. If it's your second turn and your opponent only has one active, then go for it, win the game. Or if they have a benched Squirtle, kill that thing immediately. Now it is your turn. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this build, what you think about this evolving base fossil metagame. What changes would you make to the deck list showcased here? And what cards would you like to see featured in future videos in this series? I appreciate you so much for watching, and I will see you at the next one.